There's been quite a lot of discussion on my previous video about the bridge example I gave about natural selection being the sort of mechanism and universal common ancestry, or the tree of life, being the history, and these two being connected like basically foundations and a bridge. So the actual, beam, if you like, that's natural selection, or the mechanism, or human chimpanzee tree, or the tree of life, or some projection from A to Z, and the actual foundations is actually the history. Now, what's important about this is that some people misunderstand this to say that no, these two things are completely independent, and that even if there is no mechanism, even if natural selection is false, the history is still true. Now, this is a complete misunderstanding for the simple reason that we already knew before Darwin of the fact that there is classification of life, and that there are things which are similar. And Linnaeus, way before Darwin, he categorized life in this way. He took things which are similar, he put them together. So similarities between humans and chimps, and similarities between other organisms, this was well known and documented before Darwin. But the idea of the tree of life really took off when Darwin came along and showed that this history has a mechanism. This has a way that it actually works. Now, what's happened over time is, as people are learning that the mechanism isn't really working, or it's not sufficient, or they see that it's being challenged by alternatives, they're saying, well, you see, the mechanism is independent of the actual history. The history is true regardless. Now, there's some things which need to be clarified here. Firstly, every single person, every single scientist, every single academic who is saying this, who is actually saying that, look, the history is true even if natural selection is wrong. What are they basically assuming? They're assuming there's another mechanism. They're assuming if natural selection is not true as a mechanism, maybe it's going to be something else, whatever it's going to be, but it's going to have to be some sort of naturalistic mechanism from their perspective. But they are assuming a mechanism is there. No one is saying that we don't need a mechanism at all, because without a mechanism, all you have is a story. You can just point out all of the similarities between any two organisms, but if you don't have a mechanism, all you have at best is a story. And you have a table without legs. You have a bridge without foundations. So this whole idea that, we can totally treat these as two independent things is completely false. And another point, if there is no God, and if someone starts off as a philosophical naturalist and they also happen to be a methodological naturalist, they have to come up with something like the tree of life as a logical deduction. They just have to. There is no other way they can explain away design. They have to come to some sort of simple beginning which eventually led to something more and more complex. So the tree of life type of picture is a logical deduction of somebody who is a philosophical naturalist. Now, since that's the case, and the scientists who are actually speaking about sometimes the mechanism of natural selection being false also happen to be philosophical naturalists, and also because of that they're of course methodological naturalists. For them, it doesn't matter if natural selection is wrong, because another mechanism is going to come and we just needs to be discovered. But we shouldn't think that this is a logical conclusion that science led you to. No, that's a logical conclusion your philosophical naturalism led you to, and now you're reverse engineering science to actually fit in line with that worldview. And I know this is it can seem a bit like a complex issue, but it actually isn't. In a nutshell, what's actually going on is this: natural selection as a mechanism is important, fundamental to establish any trajectory, any history of life that the Darwinists actually want to conserve, want to actually show. Now, if they say, okay, natural selection's not there, then they need to provide another naturalistic mechanism. They can't just say it's just there. We'll discover it eventually. No, they can't just use universal common ancestry as some sort of independent fact, and we've already discovered that the murder's been done, and we already are going to point the finger at the butler and say, no, it's definitely him, now let's find evidence that it was actually him. No, you actually have to show that the mechanism is there for the history to take off. You can't treat these as two completely inseparable things, and two things that are not impacted by each other. And the very fact that we're having these discussions, and on my page, because of the last video, there was especially one atheist who was adamant about having this discussion that these two things are separate. The very reason that that person and atheists like that are basically arguing for the independence of the two is because they understand natural selection as a mechanism is insufficient, or it is something which is actually challenged by other evolutionary biologists, and they do understand the actual implications of that, because that means we go back to pre-Darwinian times in which the history of life, the tree of life, was not taken seriously. So for more videos about why Darwinian evolution is not absolutely true, although it's a working model, and why it's based on a probabilistic framework with assumptions and with disputes, make sure you subscribe to Darwinian Delusions.